In the 1990s, millions of people watched a leather-armored woman fight her way through Greek mythology on television. But if you actually dig into the oldest surviving burial mounds of the Eurasian steppe, you find something Hollywood never needed to invent: the skeletons of teenage girls buried with daggers, battle axes, and healed combat wounds. DNA testing on these burials now shows that roughly a third of Scythian women buried with weapons were active warriors, some as young as 13. The Greeks had a word for women like this. Herodotus called them androktonoi, man-killers. So here's the actual question worth sitting with. What if the Amazons weren't a myth the Greeks made up at all? What if they were describing badly and from a distance women who were completely real? You'd assume this is settled archaeology by now. Dig, find bones, confirm or deny a myth. It isn't. What you're actually looking at is one of the more contested reclassifications in modern archaeology, and it only really got moving in the last 30 years, because for most of the 20th century, nobody thought to check. Here's what happened instead. Starting in the 1920s and continuing for decades, Soviet and then Russian archaeologists excavated hundreds of kurgans, burial mounds, across the Pontic-Caspian steppe, the grassland stretching from modern Ukraine into Kazakhstan. Many of these graves held weapons: arrowheads, spears, swords, sometimes full sets of armor. For most of the 20th century, the default assumption was simple. Weapons in a grave meant a man in the grave. Excavators recorded the skeletons, cataloged the metalwork, and moved on, without running the one test that would have told them otherwise. That test is osteological sexing, examining the pelvis and skull structure to determine biological sex, and later, ancient DNA analysis. When archaeologists went back through Soviet-era excavation records and, in many cases, re-examined the actual bones, the numbers were not small. Janine Davis Kimball, an American archaeologist who spent years working with Russian teams on Sarmatian and Scythian sites in the 1990s, was one of the first to publish extensively on this, finding burial after burial where the warrior in the grave was, by skeletal evidence, a woman. Here's where it gets strange. This wasn't a rare exception. Across excavated kurgans on the steppe, researchers now estimate that around 20 to 37% of Scythian burials containing weapons belong to women. The number moves depending on the specific site and study, but it's nowhere near a fluke. Some of these women were buried with quivers of arrows still in place. Some show healed fractures consistent with close combat. Some, like a set of graves excavated near Pokrovka in southern Russia, belonged to girls who died in their early teens, already carrying old, healed combat injuries. You're not looking at ceremonial weapons tucked in as symbolic offerings. You're looking at tools that were used by people whose bodies show it. So where does Herodotus fit into this? Writing in the 5th century BC, he's the earliest Greek source to describe the Amazons not just as myth, but as an actual people, whom he places specifically among the Sarmatians, a steppe culture closely related to and partially descended from the Scythians. He tells a story, half legend, half ethnography, about Amazon women who intermarry with young Scythian men and go on to found the Sarmatian people, on the condition that the women keep fighting and hunting exactly as before. Herodotus is not always a reliable narrator. Historians have caught him repeating secondhand travelers' tales as fact more than once. But Adrienne Mayer, a classical folklorist at Stanford who has spent much of her career tracing the Amazon legend back to the steppe, argues that this particular account lines up unusually well with what archaeology is now independently confirming, centuries after Herodotus wrote it down with no burial evidence to check it against. Here's the honest complication, though. None of this proves the Amazons of Greek myth. The all-female warrior nation living apart from men near the Black Sea, ruled by queens like Penthesilea and Hippolyta, actually existed exactly as Homer or later poets described them. What the archaeology supports is something more grounded and, honestly, more interesting. Steppe cultures where women fighting, riding, and hunting alongside men was simply normal, not exceptional. Not a separate nation of women. Just a culture where gender didn't determine who picked up a bow. That's the real twist buried under the first one. The Greeks weren't lying so much as translating a foreign social reality into the only shape their own mythology had room for. Women who fight couldn't just be Scythians to them, they had to become their own separate, distant, almost impossible nation, because in the Greek world, women didn't fight. So the reality got pushed to the edge of the map and turned into legend, because there was no closer category for it in the Greek imagination. Nobody can tell you with certainty how much of the Amazon myth traces directly back to these specific burials versus generations of travelers' stories. Oral exaggeration and poetic invention layered on top over centuries. Adrienne Mayer herself is careful about this. She argues for a real cultural kernel at the base of the myth, not a one-to-one match. Other historians remain more skeptical of drawing a straight line from a Pokrovka grave to Hippolyta's throne. This is still an active, argued question, not a closed case, and any version of this story that hands you a tidy one-to-one answer is skipping past where the actual scholarship still disagrees. What isn't in dispute is what the bones themselves show. A teenage girl buried on the open steppe more than 2,000 years before Xena ever put on leather armor, with a healed fracture in her arm and a quiver still resting near her hand. Nobody wrote her name down. No historian recorded what she thought about her own life. But she left behind a body that still speaks for her, describing a kind of life the people writing the myths 1,000 miles away could only guess at. And mostly guessed wrong. If stories like this, the ones where the myth turns out to be hiding a stranger truth than the legend itself, are the kind of thing you're into, subscribe. There's a new one every few days, somewhere in a museum drawer, or still under the grass of a kurgan no one has opened yet. There's a set of bones waiting to correct something else we assumed we already understood.